This is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I am the host, John Moorhead, and I am privileged today to have as my guest the author of a new book, and I will unveil the title in just a moment, Dr. Erin Stiles. Should I call you Dr. Stiles or Erin? What are you more comfortable with?
I think you should call me Erin.
I
Thanks.
will do that. Feel free, please, to call me John. Welcome to the
Okay,
podcast. It's great to have you here. Let me
thank
read
you.
the bio that's on the back of the book so folks can know a little bit about you and your background.
Sure.
Erin Stiles is a professor of anthropology at the University of Nevada, Reno. Her primary interests are in the anthropology of religion and law, and she has worked in East Africa and in the Western United States. She has conducted extensive ethnographic research on the everyday workings of Islamic courts in Zanzibar, Tanzania, with a particular focus on marital disputes. Her more recent work focuses on Latter-day Saint experiences of the spirit realm in northern Utah, where she grew up. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Here it is for those of you who are watching on YouTube. And the title of the book is The Devil Sat on My Bed: Encounters with the Spirit World in Mormon Utah. What a fantastic topic that we're going to learn a little bit about. So I'm so appreciative of you coming on the program. Could you begin by unpacking your own personal experiences growing up in northern Utah and how that would eventually come together with your academic training as an anthropologist?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. First of all, thanks so much, John, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you and tell you a little bit about the book. But yeah, so I grew up in Cache Valley, Utah, which is about an hour and a half north of Salt Lake, in a little town called Providence, which is next to a not quite so little town called Logan. And yeah, the book came about. The idea for the book came about. Again, as you mentioned, my primary area of interest in anthropology of religion is the anthropology of Islam. And so that is what I focused on for most of my career until a few years ago when a colleague, knowing that I was from Utah and had an interest in Mormonism, asked if I knew anything about conceptions of evil in the Mormon tradition, because he studies Christianity and he was working on a comparative project on different Christian ideas of evil. And I said, I don't really, but it sparked a memory. And my memory was of some of my friends when we were little, just playing in the neighborhood or out in the fields or what have you. And I remembered occasionally a friend we'd stop playing and say, "Oh, guess what, everybody? The devil came in my room last night and sat on my bed." And we'd say, "Oh," and then the friend would say, usually it wasn't that big of a deal, but the devil had come in and sat there on the end of the bed, and usually the devil didn't do anything. But I remember my recollection is that, oh, the devil had red eyes and then eventually went away. And it was and I mean, this happened more than once. And I didn't, as a kid, I didn't make too much of it. My family, we were not Mormon. We went to Episcopal church, and we didn't really talk about devils all that much. So, as a kid, I just kind of thought, oh, well, the devil visits Mormons, but doesn't really care about Episcopalians. So it wasn't a scary thing, it wasn't something that, and usually the friends weren't terribly frightened either, but it was just it was that colleague of mine who's Professor Liam Murphy at Sacramento State. His question about conceptions of evil in Mormonism sparked that memory. And so I was kind of searching around for a new project a little bit closer to home in northern Nevada. My primary field site had always been in Tanzania and East Africa, and there's really not a farther place on the globe from Western Nevada than East Africa. So it was really, my kids were little, and it was kind of hard to go back and forth to East Africa. It wasn't really something that was going to be feasible for a while. And so I thought about doing a project in Utah, and his question really sparked that idea. And so what I first did was, talk to some friends and family members from this part of Utah to say, hey, do you remember, do you have, I have this memory. Am I just fabricating this, or is this something that you also have experience with? And because it wasn't ever something I'd ever really talked to people a lot about. But as I started talking to friends and acquaintances, a lot of, everybody said, "Oh, yes, of course." Everybody has heard these stories or had these kinds of experiences. And so then my next step, I was doing some research in the wonderful Fife folklore collection at Utah State University in Logan, and I really It's kind of strange. I really don't remember what took me to the folklore collection. I'm not trained as a folklorist, and I hadn't really dabbled in folklore before. But somehow I ended up in that collection, and it's absolutely fantastic. And I ended up finding just well, I was working in the student folklore collection, which is this amazing repository of folklore narratives collected by students from about 1970 until the present. So students who enroll in various folklore classes at Utah State are given assignments. Okay, well, look for some folklore on such and such a topic, and they're all archived really, really well in the collection, and so you can search through different topics. And so I happened to find I started looking for devil narratives, and so I found a ton of devil narratives, and so I started reading through them. And these are students either telling about experiences they had had, or maybe the experience of a family member, or maybe a story that had been passed down, either in their family or in church gatherings or among a circle of friends. And so I started reading those, and they were exactly what I remembered hearing from my friends growing up. And then, much to my delight, I found all kinds of other narratives about other kinds of spiritual encounters with not necessarily with the devil or malevolent spirits, but with benevolent spirits. So spirits of ancestors, or spirits of grandparents, or spirits of future children. And so coming across all of that incredibly rich material in the folklore archive really convinced me that this is a project worth doing. And so I did a lot of research in the folklore archive, and then because I'm an anthropologist, we study religion in practice, we talk to people. And so then I started doing ethnographic research, where and my ethnographic research consisted mostly of doing interviews with people who had these kinds of experiences, or sometimes who maybe hadn't had an experience themselves, but were pretty knowledgeable about these. They'd happened to a lot of their family members, or they were particularly interested in the spirit world, and were eager to share that with me. So that's kind of how the project came about.
That's fascinating. Were people very open to sharing these kinds of things? Did you
Yeah.
have any hesitancy or?
No, no, most of the time people were quite open. I mean, everybody I asked about. I mean, one of the things that I think that I like to share in conversations like this, and I share this in the book as well, I think, is that every single person I asked about spirit experiences said yes. It's maybe either I had an experience, or my mother had an experience, or my grandma had an experience, or I know somebody who did. So there's not one person I talked to who said, "What are you talking about? This doesn't happen at all," or that's nutty. People aren't, this is, I don't know where you got that idea. So everyone I talked to, without exception, said, yes, absolutely, this is something that's happening. Lots of people were willing to share with me, which I'm very, very grateful for. And some weren't, which is completely understandable. For people who have these experiences, they're of a sacred nature. They're very significant most of the time. And I think especially when it's a benevolent spirit of a family member or an ancestor. And so not everybody was willing to share that with me, but a lot of people were. And even I'm so grateful, because even I had some folks willing to share their experiences with me, even though they hadn't really shared them widely before. So, I mean, no, nobody told me that, oh, this experience happened to me and I'm broadcasting it all over the place and I talk about it all the time. I mean, most people that I talked to about their experiences did hold it as something very special, and it was not something that was widely shared. But yes, I was really thrilled that people were willing to talk to me about it. And I think, and I explained the goals of the anthropologist approach is that I'm seeking not to evaluate or judge. I'm seeking to understand, from the perspective of the person who's had these incredible encounters. And so that's how I explain what I'm doing as an anthropologist. I really want to understand your religious experience from your perspective. And that's really what most of us anthropologists of religion, that's what we're trying to do, is understand the local perspective, religion as a lived experience. And so I think that went a long way to, I think once people really, understood the approach that I was taking, that made them quite willing to share for the most part. There were some who chose not to share, and I completely respect that, of course.
I think that perspective that you bring as an anthropologist is fascinating and necessary. And I've been interested over the years in looking at the different lenses that scholars use to look at different phenomenon.
Yeah.
I work a lot with people in religious studies, and I'm one of the co-editors of an online peer-reviewed academic journal, the Journal of Gods and Monsters, and they're
Hmm.
largely religious studies. But I've recently run into some anthropologists and some folklorists, and they have a very different take based upon the lived reality and experience of the peoples that they're looking at. Can you say a little bit about what anthropology brings to helping us understand this topic that maybe another discipline might not bring?
Sure. Yeah, I think you said it really, really well. Yeah, I would actually probably characterize the difference between anthropology and say religious studies or history of religions or philosophy very similar to how you did. And this is how I teach my students is that for an anthropologist, we look at religion as something that people do. And I actually take that phrase from one of my undergrad professors, Dr. Melvin Peters, who's an Old Testament scholar. And when I was an undergrad, I kind of went back and forth between majoring in religious studies and majoring in anthropology. And so one semester I'd declare anthropology, the next semester I'd declare religious studies. And one of my favorite professors was Dr. Peters. And I remember sitting in his office hours one day, and it was the end of my sophomore year, and I had to just decide. And I guess my university didn't have double majors or something. So I said, "Oh, Dr. Peters, I don't know what to do. I have to decide if I'm going to be a religious studies major, an anthropology major." And he said, Erin, you are really interested in religion as something that people do. And because of that, I see anthropology as a better fit for you. And I swear he was not trying to get rid of me. I was a good student, but it was he put it so well as a religious studies scholar that I've been repeating that for decades now, because I think that is really what's so characteristic of the anthropological approach is that we're interested in religion as it is lived by everyday people in an everyday situation. So we're not necessarily, we're not starting, say, from a religious text or scripture or the words of a prophet and say, okay, well, this is what the religion is, and now I'm going to go out and see if people are actually doing the religion the correct way, right? We really start from the standpoint of the practitioners, of the adherents. And so it doesn't mean that we don't care about religious texts or, key teachings. Of course, we do, but that's not our primary focus. So our primary focus is on what does the religion mean for those who are adherents and those who are practicing it every day. And so I think that's really what's so valuable about the anthropological approach is because we're, the way you do anthropology is you're immersed in the cultural context. So that's how we do ethnographic research. We are immersed in the cultural context. We speak the language. I just had a student defend her PhD dissertation yesterday. So I'm really excited about that. And she did 20 months of field research before writing her dissertation. And that's really, that really long-term cultural immersion is what we expect. So I think that focus on religion in practice, what people actually do when they are, being religious, what have you, and then learning. You have, the only way you can learn that is by immersing yourself in that context and talking to people.
Well, we want folks to buy the book, so we're not going to go into too much detail,
Sure.
but we need to let folks know a little bit about some of the things you discovered. Can you share what kinds of spiritual experiences or experiences with the spirit realm are Latter-day Saints having in your research?
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to differentiate first between experiences with or encounters with spirits and Holy Spirit experiences. So what my book is focusing specifically on encounters with spirits that are not the Holy Ghost or the Holy Spirit. That's something else entirely. And there's this anthropologist, Tom Mould, who has a great book on Holy Spirit experiences among Mormons in North Carolina. So I've got to get a shout out to that. So he's done a project like that. So what I'm looking at are experiences with two particular kinds of spirits. So the majority of these experiences are encounters with what I call individual spirits, which are spirits of people, most often people who have lived a mortal life and have passed away and are now in the spirit realm. All right. And so they're always identifiable as individuals. And if the human recipient of that visit doesn't recognize them, the spirit will identify themselves. And so they're usually the spirits of deceased kin or ancestors, and sometimes are the spirits of future children. So that's something that's, I think, very particular to the Mormon context, is this idea that everybody exists as a spirit child before being born into a mortal body, which is necessary for progression along the path to salvation. And frequently people are visited by the spirits of future children. And so this happens, I'll talk more about that in a second. And then the other category of spirits are the evil spirits, or the malevolent spirits. And so sometimes people call them demons. They're usually not the devil or Satan himself, but rather minions. And these are very, very different, because these are spirits who have never had a mortal body. So they are spirits who chose to follow Lucifer in the war in heaven in the premortal times, and so never are able to have a mortal body. And so they're not identifiable as individuals. They're usually, when people describe the evil spirits, it's never, oh, it was a man and he looked like this. It's usually described as a shadowy shape. Sometimes they're gendered, that maybe there was a voice that sounded like a female or sounded like a male. But people are usually very, very clear on whether a spirit visit is a benevolent spirit who has either had a mortal body or will be born into a mortal body, or a malevolent spirit who's never had a mortal body. So those are the two categories of spirits that I look at in the book. And so I do a couple chapters on benevolent spirits, and then a couple chapters on the malevolent spirits. So that's sort of the way that the book is shaped. So I can tell you more more detail. I can talk about this for hours, as
I'm sure you could. Does your research indicate? It's interesting to me that different religious traditions have a different openness or stance towards encounters with the spirit realm, even within one given tradition. So an Episcopalian or Presbyterian isn't going to be nearly as open to encountering the spirit realm as a Pentecostal is, right?
Yeah.
For the Latter-day Saints, did you get a sense that there is a general openness to this? And if so, what kind of part does it play in lived religion for Latter-day Saints?
Oh, absolutely. There's a very rich cosmology that explains why the mortals can interact with the spirits. So it's very much a part of cosmology, of understanding the human journey, of which the mortal part is only a small bit. So people are generally very open to it. It really ties in really well with ideas from LDS theology. And I think one of the folks I interviewed was a high school seminary teacher who had this, I can't remember the exact, I'm be quoting him wrong in my book, but we did a series of interviews together, and he's just brilliant fellow. And he described encounters with the spirit world as the core of what Latter-day Saints believe, or the heart of what Latter-day Saints believe. And so he really focused in all our conversations on the fact that you can have these spirit encounters. Really kind of encapsulates everything about what it means to be a Latter-day Saint. And one of the things that especially with spirits with the experiences with the benevolent spirits, what kind of the take-home message for me was, as the anthropologist, in terms of understanding these encounters from the perspective of those who are having the encounters, is that what these encounters do is they confirm for the recipient of the visit the reality of the idea of the eternal family, which is really kind of the cornerstone principle, I would say. I mean, I'm not a theologian, but I mean, just coming as an anthropologist, I would say that belief in the eternality of the family is really the kind of the key, the core Latter-day Saint teaching, is the idea that if you are sealed, you people, again, I don't know how much your listeners are familiar with this process in Churches of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but the idea is that if you are sealed to your family, which is usually done in the temple, through marriage, and for children born in that, that temple marriage, so to speak, is that you will have you will enjoy eternity together. And so that's and so for people who are experiencing visits from, say, a distant ancestor, or a visit from a grandparent who died several years ago, or a visit from a future child, what it really, in terms of how people are tending to interpret this, it confirms that belief in the idea of the eternal family, that, oh, that okay, so there really is something else coming, and we are all going to be together again. So and one of the arguments I make in the book, and I've done a couple articles that are related to this as well, where for academic journals, where it's the kind of really doubling down on the on the academic arguments, but I think that there's this idea that in the Latter-day Saint context, that this journey towards salvation is something that is done as a wider kin group. And that's an argument that actually this great anthropologist, Fenella Cannell, who's one of the first to really study Mormonism from an anthropological perspective, she really made that argument very clear in a lot of her work. And what I think, my work is contributing to that is this idea that the kin group is not just limited to the mortal kin. The kin group extends to the spirit realm as well. So you have the mortal members of the kin group, but then you also have people who are not yet born. They're going to be born into your family. And then, of course, you have people who have passed on and are in the spirit realm, who are still active members of the family and able to kind of intervene in human affairs. So I think that that's, again, in terms of one of the key takeaways about the significance of these visits with benevolent spirits, it's that confirmation of the eternal family that's such an important part of Latter-day Saint theology.
Well, for better or worse, Protestants tend to approach other religious traditions through the lens in which they understand their own. And maybe a lot of people do that, right? We have our own assumptions. And for them, it's doctrine and worldview. But as I look at religions like the Latter-day Saints, it's more about ethic, choose the right, ritual,
Yes.
these types of things, the family
Yeah.
connection that you've talked about. Can you share some more of the experiences you uncovered in your research and how those experiences might also interplay with other aspects of LDS lived religion, whether it's ritual or what have you?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up righteousness, because I do like to, I'll talk about that first, this conception of righteousness. And so this is something I talk about quite a bit in the book, is the 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 way being righteous is understood in this cultural context of northern Utah, where I do my research. And I quote one of my research participants in the book, who says, righteousness is more of a verb. He says it's something that you do. So you have to be righteous. You have to choose to do righteous activity. So and so one of the things that I've found in looking at experiences with malevolent spirits is that the malevolent spirits who visit in order to harass, or to try to thwart good action, are these kinds of visits, these kinds of spiritual harassments from demons or evil spirits, are really understood through that framework of righteousness. So that if you are, say, not on the righteous path, if you're doing things that you're not supposed to be doing, if you're a young person who's going to wild parties and drinking and smoking and doing other kinds of illicit activities, you very well may attract an evil spirit, right? So and some of my research participants explain that as, okay, well, the evil spirits are never going to have a mortal body, and so they're attracted to people who are using their mortal body in kind of illicit ways, and so they might be attracted to those people. But on the other hand, evil spirits are also really attracted to those who are exceptionally righteous. And so if you are super righteous, then you might also run the risk of attracting an evil spirit. And in one of the chapters, I look particularly at encounters that missionaries have, Latter-day Saint missionaries have, with evil spirits while on their missions. And so that's what more righteous action do you have than serving a mission, right? And so it's really quite fascinating, because some of the most amazing encounters with evil spirits that I've heard about have been from people who are in the mission field, so who are harassed or threatened by spirits while they're performing this really righteous activity. So it's not like missionaries behaving badly and attracting, going out and to hitting the bars or something and attracting evil spirits. It's missionaries who are really really doing what they're supposed to be doing, who might be attracting an evil spirit who's interested in thwarting their activity. In terms of ritual action, ritual practice, one of the things that I find so interesting is another realm where people tend to have a lot of spirit encounters with benevolent spirits, not with evil spirits, is during baptism for the dead. So this is this is posthumous baptism, and so this is a part of Latter-day Saint practice, a very important ritual activity in which the spirits of people who died without being baptized in the church and are baptized posthumously by people who undergo the rite of baptism on their behalf by proxy. So it's a proxy baptism, and this is a very common place for people to have encounters with spirits. And there's kind of a common narrative that happens a lot of people, a lot of your listeners in Utah are probably familiar with these stories or heard similar ones, where someone who has gone to do the work of proxy baptism or baptism for the dead in the temple is then visited by the spirit of somebody who was just baptized. A grateful recipient of baptism, say, is coming to thank the person who was baptized on their behalf, or sometimes to request baptism. So that's another pattern that I've seen, is that that people, someone who's waiting to be baptized, a spirit who's waiting to be baptized, is concerned that you're going down the line and you're not going to get to that baptism today, and so they visit someone and say and kind of request, well, I'm really waiting to be baptized, so I hope that I'll be baptized today. So that's another that's in terms of ritual contexts in which people tend to experience well, not everybody, of course, but where it's not uncommon to experience an encounter with a spirit. That would be one of the primary ones, is during baptism for the dead.
You mentioned also an interesting spiritual experience of being visited by a child who'd not been born yet from the
Yeah.
pre-existence. I remember years ago, I live in Utah, originally from California, but I came out here to go to school, and we were immersed in LDS, the heart of LDS culture, which was helpful in my intercultural studies program.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and we developed friendships with the LDS neighbors. And I remember an event which helped me learn a lot about them and about the significance of the pre-existence. They had a friend who had lost a small child, a toddler, in an awful accident. They were trying to do some work in their backyard, and the child was run over by a backhoe. The child was
Oh,
killed. We went over to help them pay our respects and work through the grieving process. And I remember them sharing that what brought them comfort in part was the idea that the child in the pre-existence had chosen this
mhm.
experience as a part of a lesson for its growth. And so it really
Yes.
struck me the significance of the pre-existence for the way Mormons see things and live their lives. Can you speak to maybe some of the experiences that you had reported that might go along with?
Yeah, absolutely. One in particular comes to mind, this with this emphasis on planning in the pre-existence. So this is again, and it is absolutely a way that makes sense of tragic experiences by putting them in a larger framework. So one of the women I worked with quite a bit on the project, I call her Lynn. I use pseudonyms for everybody in the book, but I call her Lynn. But she's had a number of really fascinating encounters, and several have been with the spirit of her mother, who passed away when she was quite young. And one of the experiences she relates is, she's, as an adult, many many years after she lost her mother, she reports that she was walking through her house and she just suddenly got this really splitting headache, and she had kind of these visions of doom kind of flash through her head, like, oh my gosh, what's going on, it's a terrible headache. And at that moment, the spirit of her mother communicated with her and said, no, you're not going to die, I already did that for you. And Lynn kind of questioned, what do you mean? And the spirit of her mother explained, well, and I can't, I mean, I'm not quoting her exactly. I don't remember exact words she used, but those are in the book. But the spirit of her mother explained that her family planned in the pre-existence that someone in their family would have to depart the mortal realm early, so die at a relatively young age, in order to fulfill obligation in the spirit realm. So, and the way that her mother explained it to her is that her spirit was needed to care for spirit children. So she had work to do in the spirit realm. And because she did that, so how she explained it was the family decided in the pre-existence that it would be better for Lynn's mother to go than and leave her children at a young age than it would be for Lynn to go and leave her own children. So it was this really, I mean, it's really an incredible story, but it's similar to the one that you're sharing, that your friends went through, is that there's this emphasis that things are planned in the pre-existence. So what looks certainly and is felt as absolute tragedy in the mortal realm, there was planning behind that. So even though it feels terrible and you grieve and you really miss this person, that there's that sense that there was planning behind this, the family was planning this. And the way that Lynn, who's just another, I mean, so grateful for her participation in this project, she's absolutely brilliant. The way that she explained it to me was that we are all in this together. Our family is all in this together, and we're all on this path to get there to salvation. We're all kind of helping each other along that path. And so that this planning that, okay, someone's going to have to depart their mortal life early in order to fulfill this obligation in the spirit world, and who's the best person to do that given these various circumstances. So I think that's a really good illustration of that sense of planning, that there's planning for this, and then the future children, those are just a wonderful just wonderful narratives about people's experiences with the spirits of future children coming to. Most of the time it's something, it's usually happy thing. It's someone who maybe thinks she's never going to have children, or maybe a couple who decided that they were done having children. We've had 4, that's enough. Or maybe a doctor says, nope, you can't have kids anymore, and then suddenly a spirit comes, and it's sometimes it's an adult. I have this one wonderful narrative from the USU folklore collection. I love this one, but it's a woman who was, oh, I can't remember exactly. So was she, oh, no, I'm trying to remember. She was dating someone. Oh, no, I think I'm maybe confusing 2 narratives or mixing them up. But it was a woman who thought she was really worried that she hadn't gotten married yet. And she really wanted to get married. She really wanted to have children. And so one night in a dream, she was visited by a young man dressed all in white, who took her on this kind of this journey in the dream. And she met 5 young people all lined up, and they were introduced as her future children. And so the young man who came to kind of get her said, well, these were all your future children. And then she reported she had the exact same 5 children that she saw in that dream. One thing I should probably say is that the spirit visits, sometimes people report them as happening in dreams and sometimes not. And I don't really care one way or the other, because it's not important to the people who are receiving these visits, whether it happened in a dream or while awake. So the participants that I worked with on the project do not differentiate any sort of different kind of significance between a visitation in a dream and a visitation while waking. They're of equal significance. So that's just a little aside, but that particular story, the woman reported as happening in a dream.
Were the visitations by future children, did they all tend to be anticipatory, or were there some that eventually had children and they were then connecting dots to prior experiences? Does that make sense? In other words, someone might have a visitation a few years ago and then they end up having a child, and then for them that's the fulfillment of that prior visitation.
Yes. Yeah, I think both. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the commonalities I see in the way people are telling these stories is that they usually they often describe the appearance, that this is, this young girl visited me and said, I'm your future daughter. Mary Beth, and she had, long dark hair and dark brown eyes. And then I had Mary Beth a year later, and here she is grown up and she has the long dark hair. So often people will focus on the I mean, they really do focus on often the name and often the appearance, that this is what my child's going to look like. And then this is the child that I had a year later or 5 years later or whenever, and she looked exactly like the child who visited me as a spirit.
Mm.
And the spirit children will come at different ages too. Sometimes they're 5 years old, 10 years old, 25 years old. So
Oh, okay.
they're not just visiting as children.
After doing all of this research, did you, I don't know if this is appropriate within anthropology, did you try and draw some general conclusions about how these spirit visitations function within lived religion for Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, definitely. I think that, so yeah, in terms of the benevolent spirits, I think that there's, kind of one way to look, the anthropological way to look at it, and kind of I mean, well, as anthropologists, we value both insider perspectives and outsider perspectives. And so in terms of the insider perspective, or what we call the emic perspective in anthropology, I think what is so, kind of the really valuable conclusion I've come to is how confirmatory they are of this central theological idea about the reality of the eternal family. And so that's how people most often frame it. And then in terms of the kind of the anthropological, like where I'm contributing, say, to anthropological literature on experience of the spirit world, I think there are a number of contributions there as well that be more interesting to anthropologists or religious studies scholars. And then I think one of the things that's, so it might be really obvious, but I think one of the things that's so interesting anthropologically speaking is that we have a huge wealth of literature on encounters with spirits and spirit possession in other parts of the world. There's a huge literature in Africa, in parts of South and Southeast Asia and Latin America, but we really don't have a ton of ethnographic studies of how people in the industrialized global north are interacting with spirit. So I think it's a wonderful case study to add to that already pretty robust literature. And then also I contribute to arguments about the necessity of expanding anthropological conceptions of kinship to include, non-humans, or some anthropologists call them metahumans, so other kinds of beings. And again, that's based on exploring those insider meanings, right? That the reality of the family for the Latter-day Saints I'm working with it's not just the mortal family, right? And when you're thinking about your ancestors or your deceased grandparents or great grandparents, it's not simply a fond memory, but it's this understanding that, well, we are all going to be together again, and we're all kind of working toward that project of salvation together. And if I do have an experience, it's kind of confirming that. So, but I think so that in terms of, kind of contributing to anthropological work on more broadly, that's, outside the realm of anthropology of Christianity or anthropology of Mormonism, which is a very tiny field, that's where I see some of those conclusions. And then I think in terms of looking at the malevolent spirits, one of the arguments I've made is that it's a really excellent case study of a contemporary religious community that's understanding evil as really a lived presence in everyday life. So when people are, discussing the devil or these evil spirits, it's not simply a metaphor, right? It's not like a metaphor for vices, and talking about an evil, so it's not simply that, okay, well, and I think that, I do not study, this is in terms of my anthropological area of expertise. I study Mormonism. I don't study other forms of Christianity, so I'm not an expert on evangelical, for example, conceptions of demons and evil. But I have done in an article, I have tried to do a little bit of comparison, kind of compare and contrast with other American Christian understandings of the devil and demons. And I think that there are some commonalities, but there really are some significant differences as well. And I think that that understanding that these are that Satan is a real adversary, and that these demons that and these evil spirits that can come and harass, they're very much real entities, not understood as metaphors for bad habits or vices, or certain kinds of sinful behavior. So they're not named, they're not named as, oh, the demon of greed or the demon of lust or the demon of gluttony. They're always, that's not something that I've encountered at all. It's very much that they're not named at all. It's just an evil spirit has come and harassed me, and is you're either trying to thwart my good work as a missionary, or is trying to kind of tempt me to be naughty in some way. And one thing I think is also quite interesting is that, again, with in a lot of I teach anthropology courses on religion, and we always end up spending a bit of time talking about spirit possession, because it's so fascinating, and there's so much anthropological literature on spirit possession in various contexts around the world. And I do like to clarify that I've encountered very few stories about, or narratives about possession in the Latter-day Saint context. So when spirits come to visit, either evil or benevolent spirits, they almost never are coming to kind of possess, or take control of somebody's body. They're even the evil spirits, they almost never possess, but they just kind of harass, or they lurk in the corner, or they threaten, or they whisper. So the few stories that I have collected, or experiences of possession, have usually come from missionaries who are working outside of the United States, who have, say, witnessed possession in the community in which they were working. So I hope
That's
I
fascinating.
answered your question.
Yeah. No. That's fascinating. One final question for you. This is an opportunity to sing the praises of your academic discipline here. What would you like to see anthropology contribute, along with things like folklore studies and so on, so that in the area of Mormon studies and other areas, I mostly encounter, again, the religious studies perspective or sociology of religion, because I work
Yeah,
in religious movements.
yeah.
But I don't run across, maybe it's just the circles that I run in, I don't run into anthropology and that perspective as much. Maybe
Mhm.
it's out there. What would you like to see by way of a contribution to Mormon studies? And so that other people, whether it's more traditional Christians or others, can have a deeper, more layered understanding of different religious traditions.
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I will first offer a quote from the great anthropologist Ruth Benedict from I don't know when this quote came from, but 1940s or something. But she's really famous for saying anthropology makes the world safe for human difference. And I just love that, because I think all of us as anthropologists, basically what we do is we study human variation in all different kinds, all kinds of human variation. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I study human cultural variation. And one of the most important things I think about our discipline is what we try to do is we use the term cultural relativism, or we try to come into understanding other cultures from their own standpoint. We don't come in, we try, you can't, of course, you can't shed your own cultural conditioning, so to speak, entirely. You're always coming from your own perspective, but we really try to table that, and we really try to understand from the perspective of the people that we're working with. That's very valuable. And so I think I really think that what anthropology can contribute is that sense of knowing what it's like to live in a different cultural context, or in a different religious context. So what it's like for everyday people. So, you could learn about Mormonism by reading the Book of Mormon, of course, and that would be worthwhile. You could learn about Mormonism by listening to speakers at the General Conference, all the leadership of the church, which I think conference just was last week, wasn't it? So,
Yeah.
that's one way to learn. But you're not going to necessarily understand what it's like to, say, be a Mormon and live in a Mormon community that way. And so that is really what we're trying to do as anthropologists. And when we do reference, we don't ignore religious texts or the teachings of key figures, of course, but what we try to understand is how those key ideas, or those key scriptures, or those key teachings are understood in the context of the people who live with them every day. So that's some anthropologists use the phrase the social life of scriptures. So John Bowen and James Below, they're two great anthropologists who have, used that term in Islamic context and in Christian context. But I just love that phrase. So what we do is we look at that social and cultural life. When we do look at scriptural sources, we look at it in context. So what does that really mean? What is that teaching in the Book of Mormon? Or what is that, what are those words of Joseph Smith on spirits and discernment? What do they actually mean for people who are living with this? And and one of the things I think that's so important is that we as anthropologists show that there's a huge diversity in how people in various religious traditions practice. So what I study in, northern Utah in terms of how people are understanding and interacting with the spirit world, that's not necessarily going to be the same for Latter-day Saints in Northern California or on the East Coast or in Peru or Bolivia or wherever. So we really try to emphasize that there are multiple ways to be a Mormon, to be a Muslim, to be an Episcopalian, to be a Catholic, to practice these traditions. There's not just one, you can't just read a chapter in a textbook on, what is Islam and say, okay, well, 1.9 billion Muslims around the world, this is exactly what they're doing. So I think that that's really one of the main contributions of anthropology, is to explore the diversity of ways of being within these larger religious traditions.
Well, you're going to make the publishers of religious studies textbook, going to make them nervous that
No,
they're.
no, I need to take it back. I am an author of a religious studies textbook. I have, it's going into its 5th edition, and I have
Okay.
a co-author, same publisher as the one that you nicely held up before. No, it's wonderful. You should, I am an author on what I think is a wonderful religious studies textbook that covers, 13 or 14 different religious traditions. And so I think that's absolutely worthwhile to do that perspective. But, as anthropologists, we will contribute a richness to that by really diving in deep into particular cultural contexts.
Right. No. I was just joking with you. I understand what you're saying.
I know. My co-authors are going to be angry, but yes, read the textbooks too.
No, I appreciate the anthropological, the ethnographic perspective. I did my graduate thesis on Burning Man Festival, and there was
Oh,
very little academic material on it at the time, so I read that. But then I went to Burning Man and did interviews with a variety of people there to
hmm.
learn what it was like, from the insider perspective.
Oh, did you?
No, I
Two of my
appreciate this.
colleagues have worked.
You can't
Yeah.
just read a book and read a chapter and say, and what's interesting to me, within evangelical Protestantism, you have a lot of former Latter-day Saints or former Jehovah's Witnesses, and they
Mhm.
then become, in their minds, self-proclaimed experts in their former tradition. Just they're an expert in their former experience,
Yeah,
but you can't experience the totality of any religious tradition. So,
of
the
course.
lived religion experience is so important. So I understood what you were
Absolutely.
saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm delighted you worked at Two of my colleagues did projects at Burning Man, one an archaeologist and one a cultural
Oh,
anthropologist. So
wow. What was the archaeology?
yeah, so that was Dr. Carolyn White, and she wrote a book that came out a few years ago, 5 years ago, so now, and I can't remember the title, but yeah, she did. So she does this. She's a really cool archaeologist who does archaeology of the present. I mean, she's also
Hmm.
worked in the past, but she's for the last few years, she's been looking at how people construct their spaces and their material environment in the present. And so that's what she did. So she looked at Burning Man from an archaeological perspective in terms of how people were creating space
Hmm.
and using material objects. It's really neat. And I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the title of her book, but it's, if you Google the archaeology of Burning Man, I'm sure you would find it. There aren't too many archaeologists who worked at
But
Burning
yes.
Man. But yeah, it's fascinating. That's great to hear that you have been out this way and done your own research here. That's neat.
Yes, most definitely. Well, we could talk for hours, but I want to thank you for your time. Let me put up the book again, and folks can look in the program notes. The title again is "The Devil Sat on My Bed: Encounters with the Spirit World in Mormon Utah." There'll be a link in the program notes for you to click and order your copy. So if you want to learn more, not only about uh, the subject matter of the book, but how to expand your understanding of what the religion of the Latter-day Saints beyond the sometimes simplistic and stereotypical understandings many times that we have. This book is a great contribution to that. Erin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Again, thanks for watching and listening. Until the next episode of the Multi Faith Matters podcast, I'm John Moorhead. Thanks for watching and listening.